Today, I'm going to be building a workbench for my garage with custom cabinet storage, all made from reclaimed lumber and basic materials you can find at your local big box store. Check it out. The 4x4 and 2x4 material for this project came from a neighbor who's having their house torn down. This wood from their back deck was going to get ripped out and thrown into a dumpster, and they were more than happy to have me come and take what I wanted before demos started. This left me a little bit of work to do, removing the carriage bolts, any nails still in the material, but did save me some money versus having to buy this myself. Now I can take my 4x4s and cut a flat reference bottom. I will cut the final length later on, but these are going to make up the posts that hold up the workbench. I take two 2x4s, cut them to 10 feet. These are going to be my stretchers and also represent the final length of the workbench. I take my stretcher, lay it out on 2x4 blocks up against my posts. I check everything for level and then can mark the height of my bottom stretcher for lap joints. Here I mark the positioning for the top lap joints after having cut the post to final length, and take my circular saw to start work on the lap joints. And now we crack some wood. Quick work with the chisel to clean up the lap joints. I do my best to remember the layout of each post along the stretcher and put the post back in the same place. I can then cut the length of my stretcher into thirds, mark the position of each post. I line that line up with the center line drawn on each post, and I hammer into place. I attach the stretchers to the post using construction screws. This will be temporary, and these screws will be replaced by carriage bolts later on. Use my level to mark the height of the stretchers on the rear posts. I run through the same steps to create the back frame. I attach the two frames with 14 of these blocks. 7 on top, 7 on bottom. To reduce the amount of visible screws from the face frame, I'm going to use pocket screws to attach these from the inside. This one block gets attached horizontally as I'm going to have a seam here on my plywood bottom. Next step is to install the carriage bolts. In the corners, I have to chisel out a little bit of extra room to make space for the nut. I use my router to create a 1/2-inch rabbet to flush fit the side and rear panels. I will be the first to admit this step is entirely unnecessary. However, I took this as an opportunity to practice something I've never done before. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. I'm using 1/2 inch plywood for the cabinet bottoms. I cut the notches for the posts. This piece was a little tricky. I had to take this out 3 times to cut the notches a little bit bigger. Little persuasion, I'd say it's a perfect fit. I left the bottom board slightly wider than the frame so I can use a router to cut flush. The boards I'm using for the workbench top are 12-foot 2x6s I picked up from Home Depot. In order to have a somewhat respectable glue up, I do need to rig something up given I don't own a joiner. What I came up with is to attach 2 solid core doors end to end, giving me one straight edge long enough to cut the entire board in one pass. This cut will remove any bowing in the board and give me one straight edge that I can run along the fence of my table saw to cut the opposite edge. What this gives me is 2 parallel edges on each board, so I can now have a consistent glue up. Here I'm using a biscuit joiner to drill the hole for the biscuits. These are going to help with alignment. They have nothing to do with any additional strength in the glue up, but they help keep the boards mostly in the same plane to reduce the amount of sanding I have to do later. One lesson learned on this glue up is I could have used more glue. You'll see in a bit I didn't have the best squeeze out consistently across the glue up. Next time I do a glue up of this size, I'll be sure to get myself a glue spreader that works better than this foam brush. I made sure to do a dry run so that this wasn't the first time I was aligning these boards and getting everything into place. The total open time on Titebond 3 I think is about 20 minutes. This whole glue up took me probably closer to 15 minutes. I do use cawls on the end, so 2 flat 2x4s that I clamp on the top and bottom to further align the boards and help with the amount of sanding I need to do here in a bit. In regards to the squeeze out, I probably could have used a few more clamps as well, but I think the amount of glue I used here is probably the bigger problem. After waiting 30 minutes for the squeeze out to partially harden, I used the rustiest scraper I could find to scrape off any squeeze out. Plastic wood to fill any cracks. At this point, the top is about 10.5 feet long. If I had to guess, I'd say it weighs 80 or 90 pounds. It's awkward to maneuver, and it's just long enough to catch the light switch as I try to put it into place. As expected, my back wall is not perfectly straight. I scribe a line to copy the curve from the wall onto the bench top. I can then freehand cut with my circular saw, mirroring the curve, giving me a better fit. And the finish isn't perfect, but it fits a lot more snug than it did. Cut the top to final length. You'll see as I'm cutting right here, part of that top falls off before the rest. That tells me I didn't have great glue coverage across the whole top. 1/8 inch roundover bit on all edges. I draw light pencil lines to track my sanding progress. Because softwood won't show scratches after finishing as much as you might see in a hardwood, I'm able to sand through from 80 grit to 120 grit and then get right into my finish. For the finish, I'm using a water-based spar urethane applied with this foam brush. I go slowly to not introduce too many bubbles, and I end up doing a total of 5 coats. I use right angle brackets I got from Amazon to attach the top. These are slotted to allow for any wood movement. Given this is in the garage, I want to make sure that that's not a problem. I'm using 1x3 poplar to make the cabinet doors. The first step is to cut a rabbet into the rails, the shorter horizontal pieces of the shaker cabinet doors. Two pocket screws per side for each rail. While it's probably not necessary, I add a little bit of wood glue to each of these seams for additional strength. I found the best way to assemble these was to clamp at the seam, and then I gently screw in through the pocket holes. You do have to be careful not to over tighten, otherwise you might split your 1x3. I can now add the rabbet to the stiles, which are the vertical pieces of the frame. The reason I didn't do this on the router table is because these rabbets do not need to run all the way to the end of the board. I can now go back with my chisel and clean up the 90-degree corner. I'm adding pocket screw plugs to give me a cleaner finished look. Sanding down the plug smooth with 180 grit. And then I break each corner with the same 180 grit just to remove any splinters. I cut the 1/4 inch MDF to size. This will be the panel on the doors. Tack the panels in place. And that's your shaker cabinet door. The doors fit snug, and I plan to have an 1/8 inch gap all the way around. So I scribe that 1/8 inch gap, and then cut that line using my table saw sled. The sled allows me to cut angles that aren't a perfect 90 degrees. This gives me a finish that's closer to a consistent 1/8 inch gap all the way around. I'm using an outdoor grade paint for added durability, and the color is blue metal. I do 2 coats of paint on the face of the cabinets. Everywhere else I'm able to get away with 1 coat. For the hinges, I'm using these concealed soft close hinges. Craig makes this jig, which makes this process very simple. I'm able to drill the hole to the right depth to accept the hinge, and then drill 2 pilot holes for the screws to attach the hinge to the door. I can then line everything up and screw the back part of the hinge to the post. The soft close hinges require a stopper, so I made these from scrap wood. All that's left is to install the doorknob. And that's a wrap. This project was a lot of fun and gave me a chance to try a lot of things that I had never done before. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more content like this, consider subscribing.